My family laughed while I paid their bills. I stopped everything quietly. The morning it happened, I was standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand, staring at a bank notification on my phone that said my checking account had dropped below $400. $400. I remember doing the math in my head, the way you do when you already know the answer but you need to see it laid out anyway, like maybe the numbers will rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. I had just paid my mother's electric bill, my brother's car insurance, and the property tax on my parents' house all in the same week, and somewhere in the middle of that, I had forgotten to pay myself. I want to tell you that this was the moment everything changed. It wasn't. Not yet. That morning was just one more ordinary Tuesday in a life I had built, brick by brick, around making sure my family never had to feel the cold. I was 34 years old. I had a good job in logistics management, the kind of job that doesn't sound impressive at parties but pays well and rewards people who show up early and stay late. I had worked for that job since I was 26, climbing slowly, taking on responsibilities nobody else wanted, until I was making enough money that my family started to see me differently. Not as their daughter. Not really. More like a resource. A dependable, renewable resource that never ran dry, or at least never ran dry in a way anyone bothered to notice. My name is Rachel, and for almost a decade, I was the invisible foundation holding up a family that never once thanked me for it. Started small, the way these things always do. My mother needed help with a car repair after my father's hours got cut at the plant. Of course I helped. That's what you do for family. Then it was the mortgage just for a couple of months until things stabilized. Then it was my younger brother Tyler's college tuition, because he'd gotten into a program that required a deposit before financial aid kicked in, and nobody wanted him to lose his spot. Then it was my sister Danielle's wedding, an entire wedding, because she said she didn't want to start her marriage with debt. And somehow that logic made sense to everyone except me, because apparently I was allowed to carry debt so that she wouldn't have to. I paid for all of it. Not because anyone held a gun to my head, but because I loved them, and because in my family love had quietly become a synonym for money. Nobody ever sat me down and said, "Rachel, we expect you to fund this household." They didn't have to. It just became the water we were all swimming in, so normal that questioning it would have felt like questioning gravity. My father worked at the plant for 31 years before his hours got cut, and after that, he never really tried to find something else. My mother had stopped working when Tyler was born, and by the time he was in high school, going back to work wasn't something she considered anymore. She called herself a homemaker, which might have meant something different if the home she was making wasn't being financed by her oldest daughter's overtime hours. Tyler, 3 years younger than me, had a business degree he wasn't using and a habit of starting projects that never quite finished. Danielle, 2 years younger than me, was the golden one, the pretty one, the one my mother introduced first at every family gathering, the one whose problems always seemed to become emergencies the moment they touched down in the family group chat. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me even now, even after everything. My family wasn't cruel in the way you see in movies. There was no yelling, no slammed doors, no dramatic betrayals staged in front of an audience. It was quieter than that, and in some ways that made it worse. It was my mother saying almost gently, "You're so good with money, Rachel, it just makes sense for you to handle this," as if my competence was an obligation rather than a trait. It was my father patting my shoulder and saying, "I don't know what we'd do without you," in a tone that sounded like gratitude but functioned like a leash. It was Danielle laughing during Thanksgiving dinner, telling a story about her new car, some little joke about how she'd never have to worry about payments because Daddy's little accountant would sort it out, and the whole table laughing along, including me, because what else do you do when the room decides your exploitation is a punchline? That was the moment, actually. Not the bank notification. That dinner months earlier was the moment something in me went quiet and still, like a lake right before the first frost. I laughed along with everyone else because I always laughed along, but something behind my eyes had started taking notes. For years, I told myself a story about why I did it. I told myself I was the responsible one, the strong one, the one who could handle pressure that would break other people. I told myself that helping my family was a form of pride, that watching my mother's shoulders relax when I said I'd take care of a bill was worth more than the money itself. I told myself a lot of things, actually, and most of them were true in the way that half-truths are true, which is to say just enough to keep you from asking the harder questions. The harder question, the one I avoided for years, was simple. Why was I the only one asked to sacrifice? I didn't start looking for the answer on purpose. Nobody ever does. The truth has a way of finding you when you're not prepared for it, usually on an ordinary day, usually through some small, unremarkable object that you almost don't pick up. Mine came in the form of a manila folder. It was late September, about 6 weeks after that $400 morning, when my mother asked me to come by the house and help her sort through some of my late grandmother's old paperwork. My grandmother, my father's mother, had passed away 18 months earlier, and her modest estate had been sitting in boxes in my parents' garage ever since, because nobody wanted to deal with it, and somehow that job too had eventually rolled downhill to me. I didn't mind. I'd always been close to my grandmother, closer than anyone else in the family, maybe because she was the only person who ever asked me how I was doing without immediately following it up with a request. The garage smelled like dust and old cardboard, and the particular mustiness of things that have sat undisturbed for too long. I spent an entire Saturday afternoon going through boxes, most of them filled with exactly what you'd expect. Photographs curling at the edges. Greeting cards with handwriting that had gone shaky in her final years. A few pieces of jewelry that weren't worth much financially, but were worth everything sentimentally. And then near the bottom of the third box, tucked inside a manila folder that had clearly been separated from everything else, I found something that didn't belong. It was a stack of documents neatly organized, held together with a binder clip that had rusted slightly at the edges. Bank statements. A copy of a will, dated only 4 years before her death, more recent than the one my father had always referenced. And letters. Handwritten letters in my grandmother's careful, old-fashioned script, addressed to someone named Marion. I didn't know anyone named Marion. That in itself was strange enough to make me sit back on my heels in that dusty garage, and just stare at the folder for a long moment before I opened it further. The letters were dated across a span of about 3 years, and as I read through them, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor with dust motes floating in the slanted afternoon light coming through the garage window, a story began to take shape that nobody in my family had ever told me. My grandmother had a sister. A sister nobody talked about, a sister who had apparently had a falling out with the family decades earlier over some dispute involving my great-grandfather's farmland, and had moved across the country and essentially vanished from every conversation, every holiday, every family tree anyone had ever drawn for me in elementary school when we did those genealogy projects. But my grandmother hadn't forgotten her. The letters were warm, full of old memories, full of the kind of tenderness you save for someone you love, even when circumstances have kept you apart. And near the end of the folder there was something else. A copy of a trust document, official, notarized, dated 2 years before my grandmother's death. I sat there and read it twice to make sure I understood what I was looking at. My grandmother had established a trust. Not a large one by wealthy family standards, but substantial. A little over $200,000, accumulated over decades of careful saving from a woman who had lived simply her entire life, who clipped coupons well into her 80s, who wore the same wool coat for 15 winters because she said a good coat doesn't need replacing just because it's old. The trust document named a beneficiary. It wasn't my father. It wasn't Tyler. It wasn't Danielle. It was me. I remember the specific quality of silence in that garage after I read my own name on that page. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even relief, not at first. It was confusion, thick and disorienting, because if this trust existed, if my grandmother had genuinely set aside this money for me, then where was it? I had never received a dime. Nobody had ever mentioned a trust. When my grandmother died, my father had handled the estate, had told all of us, calmly and with what I now recognize as practiced ease, that she hadn't left much beyond some jewelry and sentimental items, that most of what she had went toward funeral costs and old medical debts. I remember thinking at the time that it made sense. My grandmother lived modestly. Of course there wasn't much left. I hadn't questioned it because why would I question it? My father was grieving his mother. I trusted him. Sitting in that garage with the folder open in my lap, I felt something shift inside my chest, slow and cold, like a stone settling at the bottom of a pond. I didn't say anything to my mother that day. I told her I hadn't found anything important, just old photos and cards, and I asked if I could take a few boxes home to go through more carefully, since I didn't want to rush something so sentimental. She said that was fine, patted my arm, told me I was such a good daughter for taking care of this, and went back inside to start dinner. I loaded the boxes into my car, including the one with the manila folder buried inside it, and I drove home in a silence so complete I don't remember passing a single traffic light. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the folder spread out in front of me, and I started doing something I hadn't done in years, not since college. I started taking notes. Dates. Names. Numbers. I created a timeline. My grandmother had established the trust when she was 81, 2 years before her death. The trust was managed by a financial advisor whose name appeared on several documents, a man named Gerald Whitfield, whose office, according to the letterhead, was only about 20 minutes from my parents' house. The next morning I called his office before I even finished my coffee. I want to pause here and tell you that I almost didn't make that call. There's a particular kind of fear that comes with learning something that might unravel your whole understanding of your family, and some deep self-protective part of me wanted to put the folder back in the box, tape it shut, and pretend I'd never opened it. Some people, faced with that fork in the road, choose the box. I understand them completely. But I had spent 9 years quietly funding a family that laughed at me during Thanksgiving dinner, and something about that folder felt like the universe finally handing me a thread to pull. Gerald Whitfield remembered my grandmother immediately when I gave him her name. He was an older man, semi-retired, and something in his voice changed when I explained who I was and why I was calling. There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you a person is deciding how much they're allowed to say. He told me he couldn't discuss the specifics of a client's trust over the phone with someone he couldn't verify, which was reasonable, and he asked me to come into the office with identification and any documentation I had. I was there within the hour. His office was small, lined with filing cabinets that looked like they'd been there since the 80s, and he greeted me with a kind of careful warmth, the warmth of a man who has spent decades learning how to deliver complicated financial truths to people who are about to have their whole understanding of a family member rearranged in front of them. He pulled her file. He confirmed everything I had already suspected sitting in my kitchen the night before, but hearing it out loud from a professional, with actual documentation in front of him, hit differently than reading old paper in dim garage light. My grandmother had indeed established an irrevocable trust naming me as the sole beneficiary, to be distributed upon her death. The trust had been funded with careful, methodical contributions over nearly a decade, money she had quietly set aside specifically because, as Gerald told me, reading from notes he'd taken during their meetings, she had said, and I'm going to remember this sentence for the rest of my life, Rachel gives everything to everyone and receives nothing in return. I want her to have something that's just hers. She had seen it. My own grandmother had seen the exact dynamic I had spent years pretending not to notice, had watched it happen at holiday dinners and family gatherings, and rather than saying something, rather than confronting my parents about the imbalance, she had done something quieter and in its own way more powerful. She had made sure that when she was gone, I would have something nobody could take from me. Except somebody had. Gerald explained delicately that shortly after my grandmother's death, he had received a call from my father, who identified himself as the executor of her estate. My father had requested documentation of all assets, standard procedure, and Gerald had provided what was legally required. But the trust itself, being irrevocable and naming me specifically, should have triggered a separate distribution process directly to me. It shouldn't have gone through my father at all. And yet, according to Gerald's records, there had been a series of communications, letters, and at least one in-person meeting, where my father had presented what Gerald described as a notarized amendment to the trust, apparently signed by my grandmother in the final months of her life, redirecting the distribution to the estate, to be divided among the surviving children equally, meaning my father, my aunt in another state who had long been estranged from the family, and who I doubted had received anything either, and by extension, funneled through my father's control, into the household expenses that I had already been quietly paying for years. I asked to see the amendment. Gerald hesitated, and I understood the hesitation immediately, because I could see it in his face before he even said the words. He didn't have full confidence in that document. He told me, choosing his words with obvious care, that the timing had troubled him at the time, that my grandmother had been in declining health during the period the amendment was supposedly signed, and that something about the signature had seemed different from her earlier documents. But without a formal dispute being raised, without anyone contesting it, there had been no legal basis for him to refuse the request. My father was, after all, the executor. The paperwork appeared to be in order. He had followed the process. He gave me a copy of the amendment. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside his office for almost 20 minutes, just looking at the signature at the bottom of that page, comparing it in my mind to birthday cards and letters I had received from my grandmother over the years, letters with handwriting so familiar to me that I could have picked it out of 100 different samples blindfolded. This signature was close. It was close enough that I understood immediately why nobody had questioned it, why Gerald himself, a professional who had known my grandmother for years, had ultimately let it pass. But it wasn't right. The R in her name curved differently. The way she crossed her T's, a habit so distinctly hers that I remembered it from thank you notes she used to send me as a child, was missing entirely in this signature. Someone had gotten close. Someone who knew her handwriting well. Someone who had access to plenty of samples to practice from. I didn't confront anyone that day. I want you to understand something about the person I had become by that point in my life, something my family had never fully understood about me, even after nearly a decade of taking my quiet compliance for granted. I don't move fast when I'm hurt. I move carefully. I had learned through years of being the responsible one, the fixer, the one who handled things, that the most effective response to chaos was never more chaos. It was precision. So instead of calling my father and demanding answers, I started building a case. Over the following 3 weeks, I became a version of myself I hadn't known existed. I requested certified copies of every document related to my grandmother's estate. I contacted the notary public whose stamp appeared on the amendment, a woman named Patricia Ellery, whose office, it turned out, had closed down entirely about 8 months after my grandmother's death, and who, when I finally tracked her down through a state licensing database, told me over the phone that she had no memory of notarizing that particular document, and that her records from that period, due to what she described as an office fire, were incomplete. She said this in a tone that made me suspicious of her too, though I never found enough to prove active involvement, and I've since wondered how many small, quiet frauds pass through this world propped up by people who simply looked the other way for reasons of their own. I pulled my grandmother's medical records, with the help of a cousin who still had power of attorney access from an earlier point in her care, and confirmed what Gerald had hinted at. During the exact window when this amendment was supposedly signed, my grandmother had been recovering from a minor stroke, was on medication that affected her cognitive clarity, and according to 2 separate nursing notes, had experienced periods of confusion about names and dates. It wasn't damning on its own. People recover from strokes. People have good days and bad days. But it added another thread to a rope I was slowly, carefully braiding together. I hired an attorney. Her name was Carol Bennett, and she specialized in estate disputes, a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened to my entire story without interrupting once, and then said something that I still think about. She said, "In my experience, families don't usually steal in one dramatic moment. They steal slowly in small increments, until the person being stolen from has been trained not to notice." She took my case mostly, I think, because she found the quiet, methodical nature of what my father had done more unsettling than a more obvious theft would have been. While Carol began the formal legal process of requesting a forensic handwriting analysis and preparing to potentially contest the estate distribution, I kept living my normal life on the surface. I kept showing up to family dinners. I kept smiling when Danielle made jokes about her new furniture, paid for. I now understood with a bitterness I hid carefully behind my ordinary expression, at least partially with money that should have been mine. I kept transferring money for my mother's bills, because I hadn't yet decided how or when to stop, and stopping too abruptly, I worried, might tip my hand before I was ready. But I started paying attention differently. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice for years. The way my father changed the subject whenever anyone mentioned my grandmother's finances. The new truck he had bought about a year after her death, paid for in cash, which he had explained away at the time as money from selling an old fishing boat, a boat I now realized I had never actually seen sold, never seen listed anywhere, never heard mentioned again after that explanation was offered. The forensic handwriting analyst Carol hired, a meticulous man named Dr. Osei who had testified in dozens of estate disputes over his career, spent 6 weeks comparing the disputed signature against 11 authenticated samples of my grandmother's handwriting, spanning the last 15 years of her life. His report, when it came back, was thorough in a way that felt almost clinical in its devastation. He identified 14 distinct inconsistencies in letter formation, pressure patterns, and stroke direction that, in his professional opinion, indicated a probability exceeding 92% that the signature on the trust amendment was not authentic. I remember sitting in Carol's office when she read me that number, and instead of feeling triumphant, I felt something closer to grief. Because 92% wasn't just a statistic about a signature. It was 92% confirmation that my father had forged his own dying mother's name to redirect money she had specifically, deliberately set aside for me, money she had earned through decades of quiet frugality, because she had seen what I couldn't yet see clearly about my own worth in this family. Carol asked me how I wanted to proceed. There was, she explained, more than one path forward. We could file formally right away, pursue this through the courts, which would likely result in recovery of the funds along with significant legal and possibly even criminal exposure for my father, given the forgery. Or, she said, watching my face carefully as she said it, we could handle this more privately first, giving my family the chance to make it right before the legal machinery became public and irreversible. I thought about that Thanksgiving dinner. I thought about the laughter around that table when Danielle made her joke about Daddy's little accountant. I thought about the $400 in my account and the mortgage payment I had covered without complaint just 2 months before finding that folder. And I thought, more than anything, about my grandmother, sitting alone in her small, tidy house, quietly setting aside money over the course of a decade because she had watched her family take advantage of the one person who never asked for anything in return. I told Carol I wanted to confront my father directly first. Not because I wanted to protect him, but because I wanted him to look me in the eye and explain himself before the paperwork did the talking for both of us. I invited my parents to dinner at my house, which wasn't unusual, since I hosted family gatherings fairly often, one more small task that had quietly become mine over the years. I didn't invite Tyler or Danielle. I told my mother it would just be the three of us, that I wanted some quiet time with them, and she seemed pleased by that, mentioned something about how I'd been working so hard lately and deserved a relaxing evening. I cooked a full dinner. Roast chicken, the kind my grandmother used to make with rosemary and lemon, a small detail I don't think either of my parents noticed but that I needed for myself, a quiet tether to the person whose memory I was about to fight for. We ate, we talked about ordinary things, my father complaining mildly about his knee, my mother mentioning a neighbor's renovation project, and the entire time the folder sat in the drawer of the sideboard 6 feet from the table, along with Dr. Osei's report and copies of everything Carol and I had assembled over the previous 2 months.
After dinner, once the plates were cleared, I asked them both to stay a little longer, that there was something I needed to discuss. I remember my mother's face shifting slightly, some instinct in her picking up on a change in the air, though I don't think she had any idea what was coming. I laid the folder on the table. I didn't yell. I want to be honest about that, because I know part of what people want from a story like this is some cathartic explosion, some moment where years of suppressed anger finally erupts into a righteous confrontation. That's not what happened, and I think, looking back, that the quiet was more powerful than shouting ever could have been. I simply opened the folder, and I began speaking in the calmest voice I could manage, though my hands, I noticed distantly, were trembling slightly against the edge of the table. I told them I had found Grandma's letters. I told them about Marion, about the trust, about Gerald Whitfield, and the conversation I'd had in his small office with its outdated filing cabinets. I watched my father's face as I spoke, watched the color drain from it slowly, the way water drains from a tub, not all at once but in a steady, undeniable descent. I placed Dr. Osei's report on the table next. My mother picked it up first, scanning the pages with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, somewhere between confusion and dawning horror, and she looked up at my father, and I watched something pass between them, some silent acknowledgement that told me, more clearly than any confession could have, that she had known. Maybe not everything, maybe not the specifics of the forgery itself, but she had known enough, and she had said nothing, for years, while I quietly bled money into a household built partly on money that had been stolen from me. My father tried to explain. He said something about needing the money to keep the family stable, about how he'd intended to make things right eventually, about how Grandma would have wanted the family to be taken care of. I let him talk. I let him get through most of it before I said the only thing I had really come there to say. I told him I knew. I told him Carol Bennett already had everything she needed to file, that Dr. Osei's report alone was enough to open a criminal forgery investigation, and that I hadn't decided yet whether I would let it go that far. I told him this dinner wasn't a negotiation. It was a courtesy, one he hadn't extended to me when he sat across from a grieving family and lied to all of us about what his mother had left behind. Then I told him the part that I think actually broke something in the room. I told him that starting that week, I would no longer be paying any of the family's bills. Not the electric bill, not the property tax, not Tyler's car insurance, not any future expenses that had quietly become my responsibility over 9 years of never being asked whether I wanted this role, only ever being assumed into it. My mother started to cry, not the tears of remorse I might have expected, but something closer to panic, the tears of someone realizing that a safety net she had never once thanked me for was being removed. She asked how they were supposed to manage. I told her, as gently as I could manage while still meaning every word, that I trusted them to figure it out, the same way I had been figuring it out alone for years while subsidizing a household that laughed at my expense during holiday dinners.
I didn't file criminal charges. I want to be honest about that too, because I know some people listening will want a harder ending, will want my father in handcuffs, will want the full weight of consequence to land exactly where it belongs. I understand that impulse. I felt it myself in moments sitting in Carol's office reading Dr. Osei's numbers. But ultimately, I decided that the version of justice I wanted wasn't about punishment. It was about the truth finally being spoken out loud in a room where it had been buried for 2 years, and about reclaiming what had always been mine, both the money and, more importantly, the years of being seen only as a resource rather than a daughter. Carol negotiated a settlement instead. My father agreed, under the very real threat of criminal exposure, to restore the full value of the trust, adjusted for the time that had passed, funded partly through the sale of that truck he'd bought with cash, partly through a second mortgage on the house, a house that I quietly noted I had helped pay taxes on for years. It took almost 4 months to finalize everything, for months of careful, unemotional legal correspondence, for months where I attended exactly 0 family dinners, where the family group chat, once buzzing daily with requests and updates, went almost entirely silent, because apparently very little bound this family together once the money stopped flowing in one direction. Danielle called me twice during those 4 months. The first time she tried to guilt me, told me family doesn't do this to family, that I was tearing everyone apart over money that didn't even matter that much in the grand scheme of things. I told her that $200,000 mattered quite a bit to me, and that if it truly didn't matter, I was sure she wouldn't mind covering her own car payment for once. She hung up on me. The second call weeks later was different, quieter, and I think closer to genuine and actual apology for the Thanksgiving joke, for years of jokes like it, though I noticed she still didn't offer to help with any of the bills that had suddenly mysteriously become nobody's responsibility but their own. Tyler, to his credit, was the one who eventually surprised me. He reached out about 2 months in, not to defend our father, but to ask hesitantly if I would be willing to explain everything to him directly, because he said he didn't trust second-hand versions anymore. I met him for coffee, laid it all out calmly, the way I had with my parents, and I watched him go quiet for a long time afterward. He told me he was ashamed he'd never noticed the pattern, that he'd been so wrapped up in his own struggles that it had never occurred to him to ask why I was the one who always seemed to have money when everyone else didn't. It wasn't a full reckoning, but it was honest, and honesty I was learning mattered more to me now than grand gestures. The trust funds were fully restored by early spring, transferred into an account that existed under my name alone, untouched by anyone else's expectations. Gerald Whitfield called me himself the day the final transfer cleared, his voice warm in a way that felt almost paternal, and he told me my grandmother would be proud, that she had always spoken of me with a particular kind of quiet admiration, the kind reserved for people who give without expecting anything back. I cried after that call, alone in my kitchen, in a way I hadn't let myself cry through any of the previous months, not out of anger, but out of something closer to relief, the specific relief of finally being seen by someone, even if that someone could no longer tell me so herself. My parents' relationship with me has changed since then, though not in the ways I expected. There was no dramatic estrangement, no final door slammed shut forever, though there were months where I genuinely didn't know if we'd speak again. My father, to his credit, eventually offered something resembling a real apology, not the deflecting kind he'd offered at that dinner table, but a quieter one months later, over a phone call where his voice sounded older than I remembered it. He told me he'd convinced himself somewhere along the way that taking that money wasn't really stealing, because he told himself it was staying in the family anyway. I told him that logic only works if you ask the person you're taking it from first. My mother and I are still working on something that resembles a relationship, cautious and slower than before, built now on actual conversation rather than assumption. She has, for the first time in my adult life, asked me how I'm doing without immediately pivoting to a request. It's a small thing. It shouldn't feel as significant as it does. But after 9 years of being treated as infrastructure rather than family, small things carry a different weight than they used to. I still think about my grandmother often, about the quiet decade she spent setting money aside, about the specific, deliberate kindness of a woman who noticed what nobody else in the family had bothered to notice, and who decided, without ever making a scene about it, to make sure I would eventually have something that was entirely, unquestionably mine. I think about the manila folder sitting at the bottom of that dusty box, waiting patiently for over a year until I happened to be the one to open it, and I wonder sometimes if she knew somehow that it would be me who found it, that I was the one who would understand exactly what it meant. I don't pay anyone's bills anymore. Not because I've grown cold, and not because I no longer love my family, because I do, complicated as that love has become, but because I finally understand something it took me 34 years and a dusty garage full of old paperwork to learn. Love that only flows in one direction isn't love. It's a transaction disguised as devotion, and the people who benefit from it will rarely be the ones to point that out to you. These days, my savings account looks different than it used to. I bought a small house of my own last year, modest but entirely mine, no longer contingent on whatever emergency happened to surface in the family group chat that week. I still see my family, still show up for holidays, though the dinners feel different now, lighter somehow, free of the quiet weight I used to carry into every room without even realizing I was carrying it. Sometimes Danielle still makes jokes at gatherings. Old habits die slowly in every family. But now, when she does, I just smile and let the silence sit there for a beat longer than it's comfortable, and somehow that silence says everything I used to spend thousands of dollars a year trying not to have to say out loud. My grandmother taught me something in death that she never got the chance to teach me fully in life, though maybe she was always teaching it, quietly in the background, in every letter she wrote to a sister the family had erased, in every dollar she set aside without telling a soul. She taught me that the people who truly love you don't need you to prove it through sacrifice. And she taught me that sometimes the quietest people in a room are the ones paying the closest attention, keeping the most careful records, and waiting patiently for the exact right moment to make sure the truth finally gets its say. I stopped paying my family's bills, and in the silence that followed, I finally learned what my own life sounded like when it belonged entirely to me.